My name is Vivian Clark. I am 65 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I taught literature in a quiet high school in Arizona. Words have always mattered to me, how they can carry warmth, betrayal, or silence. On that night, at exactly 11:04 p.m., a few words on my phone cut through me like no storm ever had. I was sitting at the kitchen table, folding small packages with colored ribbons, little books and puzzles for my grandchildren Miles and Sophie. My hands smelled faintly of lavender lotion. That was when my phone buzzed. "Mom, you're too old to come with us. My husband wants only his family," my daughter texted. "You've already done your part by paying." I remember staring at those words as if they had been carved in stone. Too old. Only his family. You've done your part. I placed the phone face down on the table, as if by covering the screen I could cover the wound, but the letters had already burned into me. Next to my elbow lay the invoice from Laguna Azul, a luxury multi-villa package with a private chef and excursions, totaling $500,000. The number was printed in bold, the ink still fresh from the printer. It was the sum of years of sacrifice, of winters without heat, of long evenings tutoring students after retirement. And now, in a single midnight text, I was told that my presence was no longer required. I want you to walk with me through this story because it is not simply about money or betrayal. It is about the quiet power we discover when we set boundaries, even when those we love are the ones crossing them. If you've ever felt invisible to the very people you cared for most, I invite you to stay with me. Perhaps you will see parts of yourself in these pages, and if you do, share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know the different corners of the world where stories like mine still matter. After the text, the silence in the house felt different. Not the peaceful silence of a desert night, but the hollow stillness of being dismissed. I looked toward the living room where Richard's photograph rested in its walnut frame. He had passed away 8 years earlier, but in that moment, I heard his voice in my memory. "Viv, even love needs courage." He had always believed that kindness without limits turns into permission for others to take without asking. I picked up the phone again, reading Emma's words a second time. My daughter, the girl who once wrote, "My mom saves the day" on a crayon-colored Mother's Day card, now told me I was too old to belong. The glow of the screen reflected against the glass jar on the counter, the harbor jar where I had tucked away every spare dollar for this trip. That jar had been my beacon through lonely years. I had imagined Emma and Lucas, the children and myself standing together on the sand of Laguna Azul, honoring Richard with a small candlelit ceremony. Instead, the jar glistened like a cruel reminder. My fingers trembled as I folded the receipt and slid it under the jar. Then I whispered to the empty kitchen, "I was never just the bank." The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and my heart slowed into an icy calm. I didn't know yet what shape my next step would take, but one thought struck me with clarity. Control still rested in my hands. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the desert sky was wide and merciless, stars scattered like shards across black velvet. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of creosote after a day of dry heat. I pressed my palm against the glass, grounding myself in the present moment. I realized I had a choice: to crumble under the weight of exclusion or to stand in the dignity that age had granted me. The text lay there in the phone's memory, impossible to delete from my heart, but not the final word. For now, I kept my silence. I did not answer Emma. Instead, I let the message sit like a stone at the bottom of a well. I knew there would come a time when silence would speak louder than any reply. And in the quiet, as the night deepened, I felt the foreshadow of what was to come. The booking might have been in their plans, but the account was in my name. The trip might have been their dream, but the power of decision was mine. I thought of a single call that could change everything. The idea lingered like the first notes of a storm far on the horizon. With just one call, everything could be frozen. When I think back to the days when Emma was little, the contrast is almost unbearable. She once believed I was her hero. I still keep a card she made for me when she was 9, a Mother's Day card written in uneven crayon letters. My mom saves the day. She had drawn me with a cape, standing taller than skyscrapers, while she, a small stick figure with pigtails, smiled beside me. I held on to that card for decades, the paper soft and frayed now, because it reminded me of a time when love was simple and untainted by other voices. That night after the text, I found myself drifting into those memories as if clinging to them would soften the sting of the present. I remembered one summer when Richard was still alive, and we took Emma to a lake north of Flagstaff. She had slipped on the rocks and scraped her knee. Tears welled in her eyes, but she looked at me and said, "You'll fix it, Mom. You always do." I had knelt down with a bandage, kissed her forehead, and felt the enormous trust that children place in their parents. Back then, she never doubted my place by her side. But life has a way of reshaping loyalties. When Emma married Lucas, the balance began to tilt. It was not a sharp turn at first, just a chair moved away at Christmas, a glance that dismissed rather than welcomed, a polite smile that never reached her eyes when I offered to help. I remember the Christmas Eve at Helen's grand house, where the tree sparkled with ornaments collected from European trips. I had brought homemade cookies, the same recipe Emma adored as a child. Instead of gratitude, I was guided to a folding chair near the back wall, while Helen's friends occupied the front row by the fire. I watched Emma laugh at a story Lucas told, and though I was in the same room, I might as well have been invisible. Claire, Lucas's younger sister, had glanced at me that night and whispered to someone nearby, "Old-fashioned," followed by a smirk. Lucas had avoided meeting my eyes, as though acknowledging me would lower his standing in the room. And Emma, my Emma, adjusted her scarf and carried on with the conversation, not once asking if I was comfortable. The warmth of the room could not thaw the coldness of being placed on the margins. I sometimes ask myself when exactly the change solidified. Was it gradual, like frost spreading across a window pane? Or did it happen all at once without me noticing? There are no clear answers. What I know is that the little girl who once drew me with a cape now stood behind her husband's decisions, even when those decisions cut me out of the picture. The word invisible echoes often in my mind. To be present yet unseen, to offer and give, but never be acknowledged. That is a wound deeper than harsh words. It is the silence of erasure. Sitting alone in my kitchen, I turned the Mother's Day card over in my hand and felt the bitter irony. Once I was the one who saved the day. Now I was the one crossed out of the guest list, replaced by cousins, partners, and people who had never saved Emma from a scraped knee. The desert wind rattled the window pane, and I thought of Richard again. He would have told me not to beg for recognition, not to cling to people who did not see me. He had always said, "Viv, your worth doesn't vanish because someone else refuses to look." His words steadied me, like a lighthouse beam cutting across a stormy night. I slid the card back into its drawer, whispering to myself, "I have not disappeared." Even as Emma's choices made me question my place, I held on to the truth that dignity is not granted by others. It is chosen moment by moment. Still, the ache was sharp, because love is not something we can switch off like a light. I wanted to believe Emma would remember who I was, but reality was teaching me otherwise. As I closed my eyes that night, I knew this story was not just about being erased by a text. It was about rediscovering my own outline after others had blurred it. And deep down, I sensed that the day would come when that old card would matter again. Not because Emma gave it, but because I chose to keep it. I had carried a vision in my heart for years, a dream I thought would bring us together in a way words never could. Laguna Azul was not just another destination. It was supposed to be the place where I would weave Richard's memory into the fabric of our family's future. I had imagined the gentle arc of the shoreline, the turquoise water, curling like glass around the sand, the soft glow of lanterns strung above a dinner table. In my mind's eye, the table stretched wide enough for everyone. I pictured a long linen cloth, white plates catching the shimmer of candlelight, and in the very center, Richard's photograph in its walnut frame. Around his picture, I saw vanilla-scented candles, the same scent he always lit on our anniversaries. He used to say vanilla reminded him of safety, of promises that linger. I wanted our grandchildren to inhale that fragrance and connect it to love, to history, to roots deeper than their young years could yet understand. I had planned to tell them stories about their grandfather that night, how Richard would hum while fixing the fence, or how he once carried Emma on his shoulders through a crowded fair so she could see the fireworks. I imagined Miles asking, "Grandma, did Grandpa love the ocean?" And I would smile, saying, "He never saw the Mexican coast, but he loved the idea of it, of standing together where the sea meets the sky." For months I had pictured the children dipping their toes in the surf as I told them how Richard used to carve their mother's initials into pieces of wood, handing them to her as little treasures. I believed a ceremony under the open sky could knit us closer, tying the threads of past and present. It would not erase the pain of his absence, but it would honor him and give the younger ones a memory strong enough to last a lifetime. I wanted to light those candles, let them flicker in the evening breeze, and hear Emma's voice join mine in remembering her father. The dream was that grief, when shared, would soften into connection. I believed that if we stood together at that shoreline, the distance between us would shrink, and perhaps the coldness I had felt these last years would melt away. But the text I received at 11:04 p.m. made that dream tremble. I stood in the kitchen that night, holding Richard's photo, and whispered, "I thought this would be for all of us." His steady gaze in the picture gave me no answers, only the reminder of what love used to look like when it was steady and safe. The image of a candlelit dinner at Laguna Azul hovered in my mind like a fragile glass globe, beautiful, but suddenly at risk of shattering. I placed the photo back on the shelf and tried to breathe. My chest tightened at the thought that the rituals I had imagined might never happen, at least not in the way I had planned. I could almost hear the ocean in my ears, even though the desert air was still and dry. I closed my eyes, clinging to the belief that hope was still possible, yet a small voice inside me warned that this dream might be reduced to a table set for one. Even so, I held on to the vision. Dreams, after all, are not easily dismissed. They linger, whispering what could have been, what might still be if courage finds its place. The morning after that sleepless night, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. On the screen was the folder I had named Laguna Azul Fund. Inside, every document told the story of sacrifice and planning, invoices, confirmation emails, spreadsheets of expenses. The total stood firm, $500,000. It was not just a number, it was the weight of years, each figure etched with choices I had made. I clicked on the receipts from Audrey, the travel agent who had handled every booking. Flights, villas, excursions, meals with a private chef, even a sailing trip designed for families. Every contract bore the same detail at the bottom. Account holder, Vivian Clark. Authorized users, none. I read those lines slowly, letting them sink in. The world might treat me as if I were invisible, but in black and white terms, the power of this trip was mine. That fund had not appeared by luck. After Richard's passing, the house felt emptier than I could bear, and I threw myself into work. I sold his old piano, a beautiful upright that once filled our living room with music. It broke my heart, but I knew the money would go towards something meaningful. I took on freelance editing jobs for former colleagues. pored over manuscripts late into the night, red pen in hand. I tutored college students struggling with essays, spending hours polishing their words while mine went unheard at home. Piece by piece, the fund grew. Each deposit into that account was a private promise that someday we would gather, that love would outweigh indifference, that the past could meet the present on neutral ground. I had built this future carefully, 1 hour at a time, one small sacrifice after another. I had never told Emma the full story. She only knew there was money. She did not know the winters when I wore 2 sweaters because I lowered the heat, or the evenings I skipped dinner to stretch groceries just a little longer. As I scrolled through the contracts, I paused at one detail: exclusive multi-villa package. 3 words that carried weight. Exclusive because it was meant to include only those I chose. Multi-villa because I wanted space for privacy as well as togetherness. Package because everything had been bundled under my name, tied together like the chapters of a story I had authored myself. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Control was not a weapon, it was a fact. The money, the bookings, the rights, they belonged to me. And as much as Lucas might believe otherwise, I was not just a bank to be drained at his convenience. I was the sole account holder. That truth was undeniable. On a fresh document, I began typing a new file name: Those Who Were Never Seen. My fingers hesitated as the letters appeared. It was not a plan yet, just a thought forming like a shadow on the wall. Perhaps if those I loved by blood had chosen to erase me, there were others in this world who carried the same wounds of invisibility. Others who might sit at that long table and finally be acknowledged. I saved the file and closed the laptop. The weight in my chest lightened just enough to let me breathe. The truth was sharp but clear. I had the power to decide. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that one day that power would speak. There was a jar on my kitchen counter, a glass one with a blue lid. Richard used to call it our harbor jar. He said it looked like something you would find on a windowsill in a seaside cottage, holding seashells or dried flowers. Instead, it held dollar bills and coins, folded grocery receipts with small amounts written on them, even the occasional check from extra tutoring sessions. It was our harbor, he told me once, a place where dreams could anchor until we were ready to set sail. When he passed, I kept the jar alive. It became more than a container. It became a witness to every sacrifice I made. Winters in Arizona are not brutal, but nights can still be biting. I would lower the thermostat, slip into thicker socks, and layer old sweaters, telling myself that warmth could come from resolve as much as from heat. Each saved bill went into the jar. Instead of the teas I used to buy at specialty shops, I settled for bargain boxes with faded labels. I told myself flavor was not as important as the ritual of holding a warm mug. I learned to live without small luxuries, trimming away habits I once thought necessary. Every dollar trimmed from comfort was another brick in the foundation of the fund. There were evenings when the silence pressed too heavily, when the absence of Richard's laughter in the living room felt unbearable. On those nights, I would take the jar down, count its contents slowly, and remember his voice saying, "One day, this will be our dream harbor." He had always believed in naming things with hope, even when reality was harsh. Sometimes I wondered if Emma ever noticed. Did she see the ways I stretched myself thin to create something larger than life for all of us? Did she know the taste of instant noodles replaced the tea I once sipped leisurely? Or that I walked instead of driving to save gas, telling neighbors I simply enjoyed the exercise? These were choices I made quietly, never expecting applause, only holding on to the belief that the end would justify the means. I remember a night when I placed the final payment into the account. The jar was nearly empty by then, its glass side smudged from countless times I had lifted and shaken it. I ran my fingers across its cool surface, whispering to Richard, "We did it." It felt like finishing a long climb, standing at the peak, knowing the view would soon be worth it. But now, after Emma's text, the jar glistened in the corner of my eye like a relic of misplaced devotion. I tried not to resent it, not to see it as foolishness. I reminded myself that love always carries risk, that giving can sometimes blur into losing. Still, the jar remained a symbol of everything I had given up: comfort, warmth, ease. For the sake of a dream that might never include me, I lifted it gently, feeling the faint rattle of coins still inside. My reflection stared back at me through the curved glass, a woman weathered by time but not yet broken. I set it down carefully, promising myself that whatever became of this journey, the jar would not have been in vain. Even sacrifices that go unseen carve strength into the soul. I straightened my back, whispering into the empty room, "Memories are worth every penny." And in that moment, I knew that even if my place at the table had been denied, the worth of my sacrifices would not be erased. The next afternoon, I was tidying up the living room when I noticed the red light blinking on the old answering machine. Few people still left voicemails anymore, but Lucas often did. He liked having his words recorded, as if permanence gave them authority. I pressed play, expecting another reminder about travel documents or expenses. Instead, his voice poured through the room, smooth and confident, carrying edges sharpened by calculation. "She'll pay anyway," he said, his tone almost casual. "She always does." There was a pause, then the faint echo of another voice. Helen's. My former daughter-in-law's mother, now the matriarch who seemed to orchestrate more than family dinners. "Make sure everything stays in her name until we leave," Helen replied. "It's easier that way. Once we're back, she'll forget. She always does." The machine clicked softly as the message ended, but the words hung in the air long after. I felt the blood rush to my ears. I sat down heavily on the couch, gripping the armrest to steady myself. My chest tightened, and the air in the room thickened, as if walls themselves were pressing closer. "She'll pay anyway. She always does." I closed my eyes, hearing the sentence loop, each repetition a knife sliding deeper. They did not see me as a mother or grandmother. They saw me as an endless fountain, a bank that never closed, a name on contracts to shield their own credit. And Helen, who had never sacrificed a winter of comfort or sold a piano to keep a dream alive, was now the quiet architect of my exclusion. I opened my eyes and looked at Richard's photograph across the room. His smile in the frame was warm, but in that moment it cut me with memory. He had warned me of this once when Emma first married. "Be careful, Viv. Some people see kindness as weakness. They'll keep taking until you draw a line." I had brushed his words aside back then, unwilling to imagine that my daughter's family would treat me this way. The voicemail left no room for doubt. This was not oversight, not misunderstanding. It was intention, a plan carried out with precision. Let her pay, keep her name, erase her presence. I felt the coldness of that truth seep into me, chilling even the tips of my fingers. I rose and walked toward the window, staring at the desert horizon stretching flat and endless. The sky was cloudless, the sunlight harsh, yet inside I felt as if I stood under heavy storm clouds. For a moment I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, a new stillness settled over me. It was the kind of stillness that comes not from surrender, but from realization. I replayed the voicemail once more, forcing myself to listen carefully. Lucas's voice carried no hesitation. Helen's advice was given with practiced ease. They had done this before, or at least rehearsed it in their minds. I pressed stop, and the room fell quiet again, broken only by the ticking of the clock. I walked back to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and let the cool liquid steady me. I realized that this was the moment when illusions could no longer survive. I was not simply unwanted on a vacation. I was being managed, used, and dismissed with strategy. They had underestimated me, believing my silence was weakness. I touched the harbor jar again, feeling its familiar weight. This jar, this fund, this entire plan had been mine. Their confidence that I would always pay was built on a history I had allowed, but history could change course. In the mirror above the counter, I caught sight of myself, lines etched across my forehead, silver strands woven through dark hair. Yet my eyes looked sharper than I remembered. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faintest spark of fire behind them. She always does, Helen had said. Not this time, I thought. Not anymore. The machine's light had stopped blinking, the room gone still again. But in my heart, something irreversible had shifted. I understood the game now, and I also understood that the rules were written in my name. The morning sun pushed through the blinds as I brewed coffee, trying to ground myself after the voicemail. My inbox pinged, and Audrey's name appeared. She'd been my travel agent for years, meticulous and reliable, the kind of person who always double-checked details before sending them out. I opened her email expecting routine confirmation. Instead, the subject line made my breath hitch. Final itinerary, 10 guests confirmed. I scrolled down the list, eyes moving line by line. Emma Clark, Lucas Kane, Miles Clark, Sophie Clark, Helen Kane, Gregory Kane, Claire Kane, Trent Marshall, Noah Price, Ava Price. 10 names, every seat filled, every villa accounted for. Not one mention of me. My own name absent from the trip I had spent years building, the trip booked entirely in my account. The words on the screen blurred for a moment as my chest tightened. I blinked hard, steadying my breath. This was not an accident. This was proof. The cursor hovered over the call button, and I pressed it almost without thinking. Emma's phone rang, but Lucas's voice answered. "We've got it handled," he said quickly, his tone clipped, businesslike. "Lucas," I managed, "I don't see my name." He cut me off with a dry laugh. "Don't worry about it. Everything's covered. Just rest, Vivian. We'll take good care of the kids." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the empty static, realizing how easily they had dismissed me. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the folder on my desk, the one holding every contract. I flipped through until I found the clause Audrey had highlighted during our first call. Sole account holder, Vivian Clark. Authorized users, none. There it was, in black and white, undeniable and absolute. The trip existed because of me, under my authority, with my signature. And yet, in their narrative, I had been erased as if I were a ghost. I reread Audrey's email, scanning every line, every attachment, the villas, the excursions, even the private chef's schedule. It was all meticulously arranged for 10 people who were not me. I could almost hear the laughter they anticipated, the photographs they would post online, the captions about family only written with pride. In their story, I was an afterthought, an invisible benefactor who had already served her purpose. The coffee had gone cold beside me, untouched. My hands traced the edge of the contract, the paper rough against my skin. The silence of the room deepened, broken only by the sound of a clock ticking on the wall. My mind replayed the last few weeks. Helen's cool glances, Claire's mocking comments, Emma's text message. They had been preparing for this exclusion carefully, each move deliberate, as if orchestrating a play, and I had been cast out before the curtain even rose. I thought of Miles and Sophie, their small faces lighting up when I handed them the wrapped gifts waiting by the door. They would run to me with open arms, but in this new script, even their love had been staged behind someone else's curtain. My heart ached at the thought that they might never know how much of this dream had been built with them in mind. I leaned back in my chair, eyes closed, letting the truth settle. This was not a mistake. It was confirmation of everything I had feared. I had become invisible in my own story. But even as the pain tightened around me, another truth emerged, sharper, steadier. The power was still mine. They could erase my name from their itinerary, but they could not erase it from the contracts. I opened a blank notebook and wrote one line across the top page. "They will see me." The letters pressed deep into the paper, leaving grooves on the next sheet. My hand stopped trembling. I closed the notebook and placed it neatly beside the harbor jar. The morning sun glared through the blinds, catching on Richard's photograph. I whispered to him, "I see it now. They may plan without me, but nothing moves without my consent." I woke before dawn, the desert sky still pale and empty. Sleep had been impossible after reading Audrey's email and hearing Lucas's voice shut me out. My body moved through the motions of morning. Coffee, brewing, blinds opening. But my mind was fixed on the silence that followed every message I had sent. It felt like the world itself was conspiring to erase me, yet the weight of the contracts in my drawer whispered the opposite. I still mattered. I still held the key. I picked up my phone and typed one last message to Emma. I kept it simple, gentle, the kind of offer a mother makes when she wants to bridge a growing canyon. "Would you like me to pack some snacks for the kids? They always get restless on long flights." My finger hovered over the send button, then I pressed it. A small act of hope. One last thread stretched out into the darkness. Minutes passed. Then the screen lit up, not with words, but with the small gray mark of acknowledgement. Seen. No reply followed, just silence. The quiet carried its own message louder than any sentence. I sat very still, phone in hand, feeling my heart steady into something harder than grief. The harbor jar reflected a thin strip of sunlight as the day began. I looked at Richard's photograph above the mantel. His eyes, captured in that picture, seemed to ask me if I had had enough. For the first time, my answer was yes. I reached for the small leather notebook where I kept important numbers and flipped it open to the page, marked with a folded corner. Nina Patel's contact glowed up at me. She had been the bank officer who helped me set up the account years ago. Professional, discreet, always reminding me to protect what was mine. My fingers dialed almost by muscle memory. The line rang twice before her calm voice answered. "This is Nina." "It's Vivian Clark," I said, my voice low but unwavering. "I need to initiate a freeze on my account." There was a pause, the kind of silence that belongs to verification. "Of course, Mrs. Clark. For security, can you confirm your details?" I recited them slowly, carefully, every syllable lined with resolve. She typed, her keyboard clacking faintly through the receiver. "All right," she said. "What would you like me to do?" My throat tightened, but my words came clear. Freeze everything. Effective immediately. The air seemed to shift in the room as I spoke those words. There was a brief hold, a short hum of waiting music, then Nina returned. "Confirmation sent to your email. Global freeze activated." I exhaled, a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. A single decision carried out with the click of a phone call had shifted the entire balance of power. The silence on Emma's end of our conversation no longer stung. It had been answered in kind, but with action rather than words. I set the phone down on the table, hands steady. I wasn't smiling, and there was no triumph in me, only clarity. This was not revenge. It was a boundary finally drawn. I had given, sacrificed, and hoped for too long. Now the jar, the receipts, the sleepless nights, they were no longer signs of loss. They had become the foundation of a choice. The sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, washing everything in pale gold. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth settle on my face. Silence had been my wound, but it had also become my answer. With just one call, everything was frozen. By the time the Kane family reached the airport, the news had already begun to ripple through their carefully planned trip. Social media posts sparkled with excitement. Photos of matching luggage, captions like "Paradise awaits," hashtags about family only. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of mint tea, the blinds tilted to let in a slice of morning light. My phone buzzed with each new post, but I stayed still, breathing in the steam, waiting. At the check-in counter in Phoenix, the first credit card swipe was met with a sharp electronic beep. Declined. The agent tried again. Declined. Lucas frowned, sliding out another card. Declined. Helen stepped forward, her voice sharp, demanding an explanation. Gregory pulled out his phone, dialing furiously, trying to reach the resort, the airline, anyone. The line behind them grew restless, whispers floating like smoke. Claire tossed her hair, muttering under her breath, "This is ridiculous. We're supposed to be on a flight to Mexico." Trent shifted uncomfortably, carrying 2 oversized bags. Miles tugged at Emma's sleeve, asking why everyone looked so angry. Sophie started to cry when she saw Helen's face twist with frustration. The check-in agent, maintaining composure, tapped a few keys and printed out a sheet. "I'm sorry, sir," she said to Lucas. "The booking has been canceled. It says here, cancel processed by account owner." She pointed to the name at the bottom. Vivian Clark. For a moment, silence spread like frost. Emma's eyes widened, reading my name. Helen's mouth tightened, fury burning behind her lipstick smile. Lucas cursed under his breath, stepping aside to call the bank. His voice rose, each word sharper than the last. "What do you mean the account is frozen? Who authorized that?" He knew the answer before it was spoken. Back in my kitchen, my laptop chimed with an incoming message. Resort Laguna Azul. Your cancellation has been processed. As the sole account holder, your request has been honored. We look forward to welcoming you again in the future. I took a slow sip of tea, the peppermint calming, the taste clean and final. On Instagram, one last story appeared, a photo of boarding passes laid out neatly on a counter, captioned, "Family only." But the story turned bitter in real time as comments flooded in. Friends asked why their trip had stalled, why the posts had stopped. Emma's silence online matched the silence she had given me. The scene at the airport grew chaotic. Helen argued with the airline staff. Gregory barked into his phone. Claire snapped at Trent for just standing there, and Lucas's face flushed with embarrassment. Emma stood off to the side, clutching her children's hands, her gaze distant. The perfect vacation had dissolved before it even began. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Richard's photograph. His steady eyes seemed to meet mine, not with triumph, but with quiet affirmation. This was never about humiliating them. It was about reclaiming my presence, about refusing to be erased. They had chosen exclusion. I had chosen silence with consequence. The clock ticked softly in the background. I closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness of my home. The world outside their chaos was calm, the desert sun stretching across the horizon. In that moment, I understood. Justice did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered through a declined card, a canceled booking, an email that carried the weight of truth. And in the whisper, I found peace. The day after the airport chaos, my answering machine blinked again. The small red light pulsed in the quiet of my living room, and I already knew whose voice would be waiting. I pressed play, and Lucas's words spilled out, clipped and deliberate, meant to intimidate. "Vivian, this is your last chance to avoid what's coming. My firm is preparing a demand letter for damages. You'll be liable for breach of trust and the costs incurred. I suggest you reconsider before this gets messy." He paused, as though expecting me to crumble at the sound of his threats. Then his voice hardened. "You always wanted to be part of the family, didn't you? Well, now the family expects you to fix this. If you don't, we'll take legal action." The message clicked off, leaving only the steady hum of the refrigerator. I stood by the counter, staring at the harbor jar glinting in the morning sun. My pulse was calm, slower than I expected. Anger didn't rise up like a fire. Instead, a cool clarity settled over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of their words. I carried my coffee cup to the desk and opened my email. Sure enough, an attachment waited, sent from Lucas's office. The subject line read, "Draft Demand Letter." I clicked it open and scanned the contents. Formal, yes. Intimidating, perhaps to someone unaccustomed to legal language. But to me, every line read hollow. There was no legal ground, no binding contract of shared ownership, no evidence of a gift. The funds were mine alone. The travel package was mine alone. It was little more than posturing dressed up in letterhead. I printed the document, placed it on the table, and laid Richard's old magnifying glass beside it, as if giving the words more scrutiny would reveal their emptiness more clearly. I traced the sentences with my finger, each one a bluff, a gamble that I would fold under pressure. I whispered into the room, "You mistake my kindness for obligation. That ends now." Later that afternoon, I put on a light jacket and stepped outside. The desert air was crisp, the sky stretching blue and endless above me. My neighbor, Janet O'Hara, was tending to her rose bushes. She looked up, her silver hair catching the sun, and waved. "Morning, Vivian," she called. "Morning, Janet," I answered, walking toward the fence. She leaned on her gardening gloves, eyes curious but gentle. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. I smiled faintly. Quiet but not broken. We fell into step together, strolling down the sidewalk shaded by mesquite trees. The neighborhood was still, only the occasional hum of a passing car interrupting the calm. Janet spoke about the loneliness of growing older, about how silence in a house can grow heavy. I listened, hearing pieces of my own life in her words. "It's strange," I said at last. "You can give everything you have and still be treated like you're invisible. But sometimes invisibility is a gift. It lets you watch, understand, and finally decide what's yours to carry and what's not." Janet nodded, her eyes soft. "Boundaries, Vivian. That's what keeps us whole." As we reached the corner, a breeze carried the faint scent of creosote, the kind that lingers after rain. I felt lighter walking beside her, the weight of Lucas's threats shrinking into something almost laughable. They could send letters, leave messages, and bluster all they wanted, but the law was not on their side, and neither was my resolve. By the time we returned to our houses, the sun was lower in the sky, painting the desert gold. I thanked Janet for the walk, and she squeezed my hand before disappearing inside. I lingered for a moment, staring at the horizon. Lucas's voice no longer echoed in my head. The words "legal action" had lost their bite. Back inside, I placed the demand letter in a drawer and closed it with finality. I would not respond. Silence would be my shield, and truth, my foundation. The stillness I carried was not weakness. It was strength, honed by years of endurance. I touched the harbor jar one more time, feeling its cool glass beneath my palm. This time, it didn't remind me of loss or sacrifice. It reminded me of choice. I whispered, "I am not yours to threaten." And with that, the house settled into quiet, a quiet of my own making, unshaken by the noise of their demands. The house felt lighter after I chose not to answer Lucas's threats. Silence gave me room to breathe, and in that space, a new thought began to grow. If blood ties had turned into chains, perhaps it was time to set the table for those who knew the value of presence. Family, I realized, was not defined only by last names or shared history. It was defined by who showed up when the world turned cold. I opened my notebook again, the one where I had written, "They will see me." On the page beneath it, I wrote a new title, "The Forgotten Circle." The phrase felt right, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I thought about the women I had crossed paths with, women whose lives mirrored mine in loneliness and sacrifice, women who had been erased in quieter ways. The first name I wrote was Ruth Delgado. She had been a nurse for decades, giving her hands and heart to others, only to find herself estranged from her son. I remembered the way her voice had cracked when she once told me, "He hasn't called in 3 years." I dialed her number, my heart beating fast. When she picked up, I asked softly, "Ruth, how would you feel about joining me on a trip to the ocean?" Silence followed, then a sharp inhale. "Why me?" she whispered. I answered, "Because someone should see you." Next was Janet O'Hara, my neighbor who had walked with me just the day before. A widow with no children, she often sat on her porch at dusk, staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone who never came. When I told her about Laguna Azul, her eyes widened. "You mean me, Vivian?" she asked. "Yes, you," I said. "You've spent too long tending to roses alone. It's time you saw something greater than sunsets through a window." I thought of Pearl Thompson, the retired librarian who once confessed she had never seen the ocean. She had spent her entire life in the dry heart of Arizona, cataloging books and watching others come and go. When I invited her, she dropped her glasses onto the counter, her hands trembling. 72 years, Vivian, and I've never touched the sea." I told her. "Then let's make the ocean wait for you no longer." May Lynn came to mind next, a seamstress who had spent her life raising children and grandchildren, often working late nights in a small shop that smelled of fabric and chalk. Her hands were calloused, her smile modest, but her sacrifices had gone unnoticed. When I asked, her eyes filled with tears. "I've never traveled outside this state," she admitted. I smiled. "Then Mexico will be your first stamp of freedom." Dolores Rivera answered on the second ring. She had cared for her brother with dementia for over a decade, her own life shrinking around his needs. Her voice was tired, worn thin by duty. When I told her she deserved to rest, she laughed bitterly, then fell silent. "Do you really mean it?" she asked. "I do," I replied. "Come with me." Last was Eunice Harper, once the heart of a community kitchen, cooking for others, feeding children who were not her own. She had given and given, yet rarely been invited to receive. "I'm too old for that kind of thing," she protested when I called. "No, Eunice," I said firmly. "You're exactly the right age. This is for you." By the time I hung up, my eyes burned with tears I hadn't expected. Each voice on the other end had trembled with disbelief, then softened into wonder. They were women who had been waiting for someone to say, "You matter." I sat back, staring at the list of names. Ruth, Janet, Pearl, May, Dolores, Eunice. 6 women, each carrying invisible burdens, each deserving of the ocean's embrace. They were not my blood, but in their gratitude, I felt more kinship than I had in years, with those who shared my last name. The kitchen filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the scent of brewing tea. I imagined us gathered at Laguna Azul, the waves whispering nearby, candles flickering in the night air. Not a table of exclusion, but one of belonging. For the first time in a long while, hope returned not as a fragile dream, but as a promise. I closed the notebook and whispered to Richard's photograph, "I won't sit alone. I will not waste what we built on those who cannot see me. I'll bring the ones who understand." His smile in the frame seemed to nod back, approving. And so the forgotten circle began, not with contracts or bloodlines, but with a phone call that gave back dignity. The plane descended through soft clouds, and when the women gasped, I felt my chest tighten with something I had not known in years: pride. Below us, Laguna Azul glimmered like a sapphire, the shoreline curling gently into the horizon. For months I had feared this place would remind me only of rejection, but now, with 6 women beside me, the sight felt like rebirth. We stepped into warm air as the villa doors opened. The scent of salt water rushed in, mingled with blooming hibiscus. Ruth clutched her necklace with trembling hands, her eyes brimming as if she were holding back a lifetime of tears. Janet laughed nervously, her voice lighter than I had ever heard. Pearl stood still, rooted to the ground, whispering, "So this is the ocean." Her words carried the awe of a child seeing the world for the first time. Inside the villa, Sunlight spilled across tiled floors, pooling on tables set with fresh fruit and flowers. Windows open to the sea, waves rolling in their eternal rhythm. I walked to the balcony and placed Richard's photograph at the center of the dining table. The walnut frame caught the light, and for a moment it seemed he was there with us, watching, steady and patient. Around his picture, I arranged vanilla-scented candles, striking a match until their flames bent in the breeze. That evening, we gathered under golden lanterns strung from the beams. The table was wide, but not vast, just enough for 7 women to sit shoulder to shoulder. Plates of grilled fish, roasted vegetables, and baskets of bread filled the air with comfort. No one hurried. Every bite tasted like reclamation. When the candles burned low, I stood and spoke softly. "Tonight we make room for ourselves. Tonight no one is invisible." I gestured toward Richard's photograph. He taught me that memory is not just what we keep, but what we share. So we share tonight. I asked each woman to say one sentence she had once longed to hear at 30 years old, a sentence that might have changed everything had someone spoken it. Ruth whispered, "You are not just useful, you are loved." Janet said, "Loneliness does not mean failure." Pearl's voice shook, "Your dreams are not too late." May smiled through tears, adding, "Your work has meaning, even if no one thanks you." Dolores took a deep breath. "You deserve rest." Eunice closed her eyes before saying, "Let someone care for you too." Their words hung in the air, soft yet fierce, as if carried by the tide itself. I felt Richard's presence stronger than ever, his memory filling the silence between us. At the end, I reached into my bag and drew out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the string of pearls Richard had given me on our 20th anniversary. I had worn them on every important day of my life: weddings, graduations, even Emma's first Mother's Day celebration. Tonight, they would not return to my drawer. I turned to Ruth and pressed them into her hand. "These are for you," I said. She shook her head, startled. "I can't, Vivian." "Yes, you can," I interrupted gently. "You spent your life tending to others. It's time someone saw you. These pearls should rest on the neck of someone who knows what it means to give without recognition. Wear them, Ruth. Let them remind you that you are seen." Her tears fell freely as she clasped them around her neck. The other women clapped softly, some wiping their own eyes. The room seemed to exhale, the ocean outside humming in approval. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to explain, no ache of exclusion pressing at my ribs. There was space at the table for each of us, and in the flicker of candlelight, every voice rose and was heard. I leaned back, listening to the waves, to laughter softened by gratitude. This was the family I had chosen, the family who had chosen me in return. And in their company, I was whole. The night after our first dinner at Laguna Azul, I slipped off my sandals and stepped barefoot onto the sand. The others followed slowly, our shadows stretching under lantern light as we made our way toward the shoreline. The ocean glimmered beneath the stars, each wave folding into the next, whispering like a secret kept for centuries. I breathed deeply, the salt air clearing the heaviness from my chest. We walked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that binds rather than separates. The women carried their own thoughts, their own memories. Ruth traced the pearls at her neck as though reassuring herself they were real. Janet lifted her face to the sky, whispering the names of old friends now gone. Pearl crouched at the water's edge, letting the waves wash over her feet, giggling like a child. May stood tall, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, while Dolores and Eunice clasped hands, steadying one another as the tide swirled around their ankles. I closed my eyes and let the ocean's rhythm sink with my breath. In that space, a memory surfaced. Years ago, Pastor Miller had stood at Richard's funeral, speaking words that at the time I had only half heard through the fog of grief. "Even love needs boundaries," he had said. At the time, the phrase had felt harsh, almost sacrilegious. Love was supposed to be infinite, wasn't it? But now, decades later, those words rang with clarity. Without boundaries, love curdles into entitlement. Without limits, kindness turns into a leash. I whispered the words aloud to the women beside me. Even love needs boundaries. They looked at me, nodding slowly, as if they had each lived a version of that truth. We carried small pieces of paper I had prepared earlier, folded squares no larger than a palm. I handed them out, along with pens. "Write a message," I told them, "the words you needed most but never heard. Then give them to the waves." The women knelt or stood, scribbling under the canopy of stars. Ruth wrote slowly, tears spotting her page. Janet pressed hers firmly, her handwriting bold and certain. Pearl hesitated, then scrawled quickly before the ink could blur. May wrote in neat, careful strokes, while Dolores paused for long moments between words. Eunice held her page close to her chest before letting it go. One by one, they released their notes into the surf. The water reached out, pulling each paper away, dissolving ink into salt. The tide carried their unspoken hurts farther and farther until they were only ripples in the dark. When it was my turn, I unfolded my paper. In simple letters, I had written, "Kindness breeds entitlement when it forgets to protect itself." I held it for a moment, then set it on the water. The tide caught it instantly, carrying it out to join the others. I felt lighter, as though a weight I had carried for years had finally slipped from my shoulders. We stood together under the stars, the ocean murmuring its endless hymn. No laughter this time, no chatter, only the sound of waves, our breathing, and the knowledge that we were not alone. In that quiet communion, I felt Richard near me again, not as a ghost of loss, but as a reminder that love without boundaries was never his way. He'd always wanted me to stand, to guard what mattered, to know my worth. I looked at the women beside me, and I realized that what bound us was not blood, but recognition. We had each been overlooked, taken for granted, pushed aside. Tonight we reclaimed a fragment of ourselves, not loudly, not angrily, but in calm defiance under the stars. The waves lapped at our feet, cool and insistent, a reminder that the world is always moving forward. I tilted my face to the night sky, whispering words not to anyone in particular, but to the universe itself. I erased that kindness. Not all of it, only the kind that cost me my dignity. We stayed there until the candles on the balcony had burned low, until the stars seemed to dim with the approach of dawn. Then, with our footprints trailing behind us, we returned to the villa. Inside waited warmth, but outside, under the vast sky, we had already found something greater: clarity. The morning sun spilled across the villa's balcony when I opened my laptop. The sound of waves reached me even through the glass, steady and soothing. For a moment, I thought of Richard and how he used to say, "A new day clears the dust from yesterday." I wanted to believe that, but as the screen flickered awake, reality arrived in the form of a new email. The subject line, "Refund Request." It was from Emma. My chest tightened before I even clicked it open. Her words were polite but clipped, written as if she were drafting a business memo. "Mom, we've had so much stress and unexpected expenses. The resort was mishandled and costs have spiraled. Could you please refund the deposit? It would mean a lot to us during this difficult time." I read it twice, then a third time. Deposit. The word sat like a stone on the page. There had been no deposit. Every payment had come directly from my account. Every dollar transferred from years of sacrifices tucked into that harbor jar. There was no shared fund, no joint responsibility. I whispered to myself, it was never theirs to lose. I minimized the email and stared out at the ocean. A group of pelicans flew low across the waves, wings skimming the water. I thought of how many years I had stretched myself thin, cutting corners, working extra hours, believing it would all lead to family closeness. Now those same people who told me I was too old, too unnecessary, asked for more. The request wasn't just financial. It was another attempt to erase the truth. Before I could close the laptop, a notification buzzed on my phone, a voice note. I tapped it open, and Miles's small voice filled the room. "Grandma, I missed you." Just 4 words, high-pitched and unguarded, carrying the raw honesty of a child too young to understand betrayal. His tone was not rehearsed, not calculated. It was longing, pure and simple. I held the phone to my chest, eyes stinging. For a moment, I was back in the kitchen in Arizona, tying ribbons on little gifts for him and Sophie. I imagined him tugging at my sleeve, asking me to read him one more story, begging for pancakes in the morning. The sound of his voice cut deeper than Emma's email because it reminded me that love still lived somewhere inside this broken chain, but love alone could not undo the truth. Miles's innocence could not erase Lucas's greed or Helen's manipulation. Even Emma's words were coated with entitlement, as if the years of sacrifice were not enough. My heart ached, torn between wanting to run to my grandson and needing to protect the boundary I had finally drawn. I played the message again. "Grandma, I missed you." His voice wavered at the end, as if he were about to cry. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the balcony door, whispering into the air, "I miss you too, sweetheart." I thought of replying to Emma, crafting a careful explanation about ownership and boundaries. But the longer I stared at her email, the more I realized that explanations had become useless. She didn't want understanding. She wanted access. My silence, though painful, was stronger than any justification. I closed the laptop slowly, as if sealing away not just the email, but the entire history of being used. My gaze fell on Richard's photograph on the table, surrounded by the vanilla candles. I touched the frame lightly. "You always said kindness without lines becomes a leash," I murmured. "I see it now." Behind me, the women from the Forgotten Circle stirred, their laughter drifting through the villa as they prepared breakfast. Their voices carried warmth and presence, reminding me that connection was still possible, just not in the places I had first sought it. I slipped the phone into my pocket, knowing I would save Miles's voice note forever. It would not change my decision, but it would remain a reminder that my love for him was real, untarnished by the choices of his parents. He might never know the full story, not until he was older, but he would always know that his grandmother had hurt him. I poured myself a cup of tea and stepped onto the balcony. The sea stretched wide and endless, carrying both sorrow and freedom. I lifted the cup to my lips and said quietly, "Some requests deserve silence." I sat at the table long after the others had gone out for a morning walk, the email from Emma still glowing on my laptop screen. I had read it 3 times the night before, and now I read it again, each word like a carefully measured drop of poison. Refund, deposit, stress. Words chosen to disguise demand as need. I could almost hear Lucas shaping those sentences, his voice pressing her to try one more angle. I closed the laptop with deliberate calm, the sound of it snapping shut louder than any reply I could give. The villa was filled with the scent of sea salt carried in by the breeze. Outside, the women's voices drifted faintly, laughter mingling with the rush of waves. Their joy was real, grounded, unforced. I clung to that sound, letting it remind me that life could still hold sweetness. Yet the weight of Emma's email pressed at the back of my mind like an unwelcome hand on my shoulder. I stood, stretching stiff muscles, and wandered into the kitchen. The harbor jar sat near the window where the morning light struck it. Its blue lid gleamed faintly, the glass still smudged from years of my fingers tracing its surface. I had carried that jar through lean winters, through lonely holidays, through countless nights when hope was the only thing filling the house. It had once symbolized sacrifice, love, and a promise that family would gather again. Now it seemed to hold only silence. I reached out and lifted it, heavier than I remembered, though the contents were sparse. My reflection curved back at me in the glass. A woman lined with years, silver threading her dark hair, eyes steady now instead of desperate. I turned it in my hands slowly, the coins inside clinking with each shift. They sounded like ghosts of the past, reminding me of every choice I had made. Then it slipped. Not far, just a sudden slide through my hands as if pulled by gravity stronger than my grip. It struck the edge of the counter, then the tiled floor. The sound cracked through the villa, sharp, final. Glass split not into sharp shatters but into large, jagged pieces, coins scattering across the tiles. The harbor jar lay broken at my feet, years of sacrifice spilling freely, no longer contained. I knelt, fingers brushing the fragments. For a moment, grief welled up, but then something else pushed through. Release. It was as though the jar had broken open the illusion I had lived under, the belief that constant giving would earn me a seat at the table. It never had. It never would. And now, I no longer needed that illusion. I picked up a fragment, turning it so the light caught its edges. The glass glittered like water under the sun, dangerous but also beautiful. I smiled faintly, a small, private smile. "I'm done," I whispered. The words tasted of freedom. The women returned not long after, carrying seashells and bits of coral they had collected. They found me sweeping the floor, the shards gathered in a pile, the coins resting in a small bowl. Janet touched my arm. "Accident?" she asked gently. "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "An ending." She nodded, as if she understood. The others quietly joined in, helping me clear the last of the glass. No one asked more. No one pressed. They simply accepted the truth that hung in the air. Something old had ended, and something new was beginning. Later, as the villa settled into calm again, I stepped onto the balcony. The ocean wind carried the faint sound of Richard's wind chimes, the ones I had brought from Arizona and hung by the doorway. They rang softly, each note delicate, reminding me of his steady presence. I closed my eyes, listening. Not to sorrow, not to loss, but to the quiet affirmation that I had finally chosen myself. The jar was gone, but the clarity remained. Silence was no longer the wound they had inflicted on me. Silence was my answer, my strength, my inheritance to myself. The last evening at Laguna Azul arrived with a sky painted in shades of rose and gold. Lanterns swayed gently above our table on the terrace, casting circles of light that danced across the wood. The ocean whispered below, steady and eternal, as if reminding us that endings could also be beginnings. The women of the Forgotten Circle moved easily around one another now, laughter flowing as naturally as the tide. What had started as disbelief when I first invited them had transformed into belonging. I placed Richard's photograph at the center of the table once more. Around it, the vanilla-scented candles flickered, their glow softening the lines of every face. Then, with careful hands, I added something I had carried all this way, a card worn from years of being opened and read. The Mother's Day card Emma had given me at 9 years old. The crayon letters, faded but still bold, declared, "My mom saves the day." For years it had been a reminder of love, then later, a symbol of loss. Tonight it was neither. Tonight it was evidence that presence, showing up, being there, was what mattered most. The women grew quiet as I laid the card beside Richard's photo. "This," I said softly, "was once the proof that I mattered to my daughter. I thought if I kept giving, kept sacrificing, I would hold on to that place in her life. But love without presence is only memory. Family is not defined by who shares your blood. Family is who shows up." A hush lingered. broken only by the sound of waves. Then I invited each woman to speak one final sentence, a message they would leave to their younger selves. Ruth lifted her chin, her pearls catching the lantern light. "You were never invisible," she said firmly, as if addressing the years her son had ignored her. Janet whispered, "Solitude is not shame." Pearl smiled through tears. "You were always allowed to dream." May's voice trembled but held steady. "Your worth is not measured in sacrifice alone." Dolores exhaled deeply. "It is all right to rest." Eunice placed her hand flat on the table. "Love deserves to come back to you." When my turn came, I looked at the card and then at Richard's photo. "You will be tested," I said aloud to the girl I once was, the young mother who believed giving everything would guarantee love. "But you will learn that silence can be strength, that dignity is louder than demand. You will find family not only in blood, but in the ones who choose to sit beside you." The women nodded, each recognizing their own truth in mine. The lanterns flickered as a breeze swept through, carrying the faint ring of the wind chimes I had hung by the villa's door. The sound blended with the ocean, delicate yet sure, as if Richard himself approved. We lingered long into the night, our words weaving together like threads of a quilt stitched from resilience. At one point, Pearl leaned close and whispered, "This feels like the family dinner I always dreamed of." I squeezed her hand, feeling warmth rush through me. It was not the table I had originally imagined, but it was the table that mattered. Before we parted for the evening, I turned to the group with a smile that came from the deepest part of me. I thought my legacy would be money or property, but I see now it is presence. It is the gift of showing up, and it is never too late to start. The ocean roared softly as though echoing my words. I knew the story of exclusion would follow me home, that Emma and Lucas would continue to justify and demand, but that was no longer my burden. I had given them silence, and I would keep it. My true inheritance had already been passed on to the ones who sat with me tonight. As the candles burned low, I looked once more at the Mother's Day card. I placed it gently back into my bag, not as a relic of pain, but as a reminder that the definition of family could evolve. Then I faced the horizon and spoke to the women, to Richard, and to anyone who might listen. In my place, would you have unlocked the fund? It was not only a question to them, but to whoever would hear my story beyond this night. A question for strangers, for listeners, for all who had once felt invisible. The choice was theirs to ponder, and with that the evening closed, not with grief, not with triumph, but with quiet healing. I had found my family in the ones who showed up, and I had reclaimed myself in the silence that remained. The lanterns dimmed, the sea kept singing, and I carried the certainty that presence, simple, steady, unwavering, was the truest legacy I could leave behind.